Well, Neil, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the British Columbia greenhouse gas inventories. The new numbers came out the other day. Maybe you could give us an overview and walk us through the inventories, where we're at, where we've been, and maybe where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Malcolm. So British Columbia has a legislative target to be 40% down on greenhouse gas emissions between 2007 and 2030. So our baseline year is 2007. So that's different to the federal government, different to some of the other Canadian jurisdictions, but that's our start point. So when we talk about the inventory from 2007, we are on a net basis down 2% between 2007 and 2017. And I guess I should caveat this by saying these are numbers for 2017 that were released, not for 2019. It takes about a year, 18 months to collect these numbers together. So these are for effectively 2-year lag. So we are a little up on last year, but on a net basis, still down from 2007. But the numbers have been climbing over the last year or two.
Now, the objective, as I gathered, is to get to 80% of the 2007 numbers by 2050. That sounds
correct.
Like a pretty ambitious target.
It absolutely is ambitious. It's in line with where the UN scientists are saying every jurisdiction around the world will have to be to keep climate change at a reasonable and manageable level. And that was really what led to the Paris targets around the commitment to try and keep global warming below 2%, ideally aiming for 1.5%, based around newer 2030 targets that Canada has, that most of the rest of the world has, and that BC, while not a signatory to that because we're not a state, we're not a nation, we try to keep our targets in line with the latest science in that way.
What are the actual numbers in megatons per year? Where are we at, and where do we have to be in 2050?
Yeah, so on a gross basis, we're at 64.5 megatons now. We have some forest offset programs in BC, which is why I talk about net versus gross. But in terms of the actual emissions in BC, the gross level 64.5 megatons. So the target is a percentage reduction target, but and every year those numbers get adjusted and changed, even the base 2007 numbers, which is why we never talk about a specific megaton. We talk about percentages, but roughly speaking, we have to get to about 13 megatons or thereabouts based on today's numbers by 2050.
Wow, that's a low number, because nationally, I think Canada is at around 720 megatons. Alberta all by itself is 263 megatons. So the idea of BC getting down to 13 megatons seems very ambitious. So let's talk about how BC wants to do that. And the one thing that I noticed going through the CleanBC document is that carbon pricing is one tool in the toolkit, but it doesn't play a big role. And we've had this debate in Canada about carbon pricing, but BC has decided not to go whole hog in that direction. You want to maybe give us your take on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's 100% accurate. So BC has committed to getting our carbon price to $50 by 2021, which is in line with the federal mandated level, $50 for each jurisdiction by 2022. So BC is actually going to be there a year earlier than that. The numbers in CleanBC, that 1.8 megatons of the total 19 megatons that CleanBC modeled as achieving by 2030, only relates to the carbon tax increase from $30 to $50. The base $30 is already assumed to be in those numbers.
Now that makes a lot more sense. And what are some of the other tools in the toolkit?
So the CleanBC has 39 different policies and programs within it. There is a range of things across households, across businesses, across industry. We've taken a combined approach, trying to pick the most rational and economically the pieces that make the most sense, as well as the things that we know how to do now. So it ranges from incentives for individuals and companies to purchase clean energy vehicles, to purchase heat pumps and cleaner natural gas furnaces and the like for their homes. So we're trying to get our transportation fleets cleaner. We're trying to get our homes and our buildings cleaner, and moving more towards clean electricity and biofuels. BC has a very big natural advantage in the fact that we have those historic hydro assets. Gives us the opportunity, if we move from fossil fuel sources to electricity directly, such as gasoline to electric vehicles or natural gas at homes to electricity heating and water heating and space heating, then we can do that in a very GHG effective way. Other provinces, Ontario, for example, in the last 10 years, have had to shut down those coal fire stations first. So it enables them to get very large reductions in a relatively, I say easy, not always easy in practice, but you understand what I mean. There are one or two programs, such as shutting down coal-fired power stations, which can very quickly get you large GHG reductions. Those opportunities don't exist in BC, but what we can do is use that electricity in homes, in our vehicle fleets, and in industry, both upstream oil and gas, but also mines and other heavy industrial sites as well.
Here's another thing that struck me in looking at the data and at the CleanBC strategy, Neil. A couple of years ago, I was interviewing Dr. Fred Beach, who's the executive director of the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Houston. And something he said stuck with me, which is that we have all the technology we need for the energy transition to decarbonize. What we need is to get the time to have that technology be adopted, and to do it at scale and do it across the global energy system. So when I look at BC and I see, you're looking at electric vehicles, you're looking at heat pumps for homes and other kinds of technologies within the home to manage heat and manage lights and all of that sort of thing. You're looking at, it seems like everything that we need is there. We need to implement it better. We need to implement it faster. We need to implement it across the provincial economy. And that just takes a little time, but it looks like there's room for optimism.
I think you're absolutely right. That's why CleanBC, with things that we know how to do and that are economically feasible and that make sense to people and to industry, gets us 75% of the way towards those 2030 targets. There are challenges around these pieces, not least the cost of technology. Many of these technologies are still in relatively short supply. So electric vehicles, we know electric vehicles can solve the problems. However, there aren't electric pickups openly on the market yet. There aren't electric heavy-duty vehicles openly on the market yet. So while I think Dr. Beach is absolutely correct in that we understand some of these technological solutions, it may be that they're just not quite feasibly ready or economically ready. We could do it, but the cost would be extreme. Right. And if we wait a few years, those potentials are more feasible. Yeah.
Sure. And the example of that, if you look at electrification of transportation, personal or passenger vehicles are more ready, and buses are pretty much ready. Transit buses, freight trucks are not, and so eventually those will have to come a little down the road as they're developed.
That's right, and that's why BC has programs such as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard in the short term, which is adding renewable blends and decarbonising the diesel and gasoline pools. So while those vehicles and off-road equipment as well are still using gasoline and diesel, those fuels themselves are getting cleaner over time, greater and greater blends of biofuels in there. And also why CleanBC referenced hydrogen and biofuel strategy. So one of the things we said we were going to do next, and is absolutely underway, is really look at how the combination of the clean electricity we have here and the other resources we have, water not least amongst them, can create a hydrogen economy here in BC for our use. But also CleanBC is this economic environment plan together. If we solve some of these problems here in BC, it makes them available to other jurisdictions as well. We also, on a similar note, have significant amount of forestry residues and fibre, large forest stock in BC. If we can find credible, economic and practical ways of utilising that and creating liquid or gaseous fuels from that wood waste, we have a thriving biofuels economy. So again, CleanBC talks to that, and there's a commitment in there to have 650 million litres of biodiesel ready and in our fuel pools by 2030.
Neil, this will be my final question. I want to talk about forests. You say that there's I'm sorry, was it a megaton a year of offsets from forestry practices?
That's correct. In our progress to targets, we use those. They're not directly in the inventory, to be clear, but as we count progress towards targets, then that is correct.
And how is that offset created? Is that because they act as a carbon sink, or is it some other aspect of it?
Correct. So there are existing programs under previous official government offset protocols. These projects are all on the BC Carbon Registry for people to look at, that are changing forest practices, and they are effectively securing trees for the next 100 years that may otherwise or would otherwise not have been there. So they're not being cut for harvest. There's no roads going through those forests. There are other forestry practices that are effectively making sure those trees will stand for 100 years, and those projects are validated. And while they're not necessarily purchased as offsets, they do sit on the BC Carbon Registry, and they are actual tons that BC uses when we count our progress towards our targets.
Neil, thank you very much. This is very interesting, and we'll look forward to chatting with you more about GHG emissions in BC in the future.
You're welcome. Thank you, Malcolm.